It started like any other night. A casual dinner at home, just the two of us. Sheila sat across from me, playing with her fork, barely touching her food. I should have noticed something was off earlier, the way she avoided my eyes, the way she sighed heavily as if carrying some invisible burden. But I had already stopped expecting warmth from her a long time ago. Then, she put her fork down, straightened her back, and, in the calmest voice possible, said, "I'm leaving you." I stared at her for a moment, letting the words hang between us. It wasn't a confession of regret, not a tearful admission of guilt. No, her tone carried something else entirely: relief. Like she had been waiting for this moment, savoring it. I didn't react the way she expected. I didn't slam my fists on the table, didn't demand answers, didn't even ask, why. Instead, I smirked. And that's when her confidence wavered. The little hint of smugness she had in her eyes flickered, replaced by hesitation. That reaction, it wasn't what she had anticipated. Sheila swallowed hard. "Did you hear me?" I said. "I'm leaving." I leaned back in my chair, running my fingers along the rim of my glass. "Oh, I heard you," I said casually. "I just don't think you're ready for what's coming next." Before she could demand an explanation, the front door opened. A shadow moved in from the hallway, and Sheila's face drained of color. The arrogant composure she had just seconds ago crumbled instantly. She gasped, her lips parting, but no words came out. Because standing there, right at the entrance, was someone she never expected to see at this moment. And that was when the real show began. The moment Sheila saw him, her entire body stiffened. Her hand, which had been resting on the table, trembled slightly before she clenched it into a fist. Her breath hitched, her mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. I let the silence stretch, watching the panic creep into her eyes. She wasn't expecting this. She thought she was in control of the night, of the narrative. She had rehearsed her lines, imagined how I would react, probably even practiced her best sympathetic but firm expression in the mirror. But this wasn't part of her script. The man standing in the doorway took a step forward, the dim light from the hallway casting sharp shadows on his face. He was calm, too calm. His expression was unreadable, his eyes locked onto Sheila like a predator assessing wounded prey. Sheila's lips quivered. What are you doing here?" she finally managed to stammer. The man tilted his head slightly, as if surprised by the question. "That's what I should be asking you, don't you think?" His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was an underlying tension in it, like a taut wire ready to snap. I watched as Sheila's mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. She turned to me, as if I could somehow explain it to her. As if I was the one who had set this in motion. And in a way, I was. I took a slow sip of my drink before setting the glass down with a soft clink. "Go ahead, Sheila. Why don't you tell him?" Sheila's breathing grew shallow. Her eyes darted between us, searching for an escape, an excuse, anything. But there was no way out of this. Because the man standing at the door was her lover's husband. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could practically hear Sheila's heartbeat pounding against her ribcage, see the beads of sweat forming at her temple. She had never looked so vulnerable, so utterly powerless. Sheila's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't understand." The man took another step forward, and for the first time, his expression shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal. It was something far worse, disgust. "You don't understand?" he repeated, his tone dripping with incredulity. "You slept with my wife. My pregnant wife. And you have the audacity to sit here and pretend like you don't know what's happening?" The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Sheila flinched as if she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing coherent came out. Her skin had lost all its color, and for the first time in her life, she had no defense. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "I told you," I said, my voice steady. "You weren't ready for what's coming next." Sheila's eyes snapped back to me, wide with horror. It was only now that she realized this wasn't a coincidence. I had planned this. I had known everything, and I had set her up perfectly. The man at the door let out a slow breath, shaking his head. I had my suspicions, but I never had proof. Not until now. His gaze burned into Sheila. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sheila finally found her voice, though it was weak, unconvincing. I didn't know she was a... Don't, he cut her off sharply. "Don't you dare insult me with your lies. You knew exactly what you were doing." A heavy silence followed. Sheila looked like she was about to crumble into herself. And I simply sat back and watched. Because this was only the beginning. Sheila's body sagged as if her bones had turned to lead. I could see it, the moment realization truly struck her. This wasn't just about her leaving me. It wasn't about taking control of her narrative. It was about the fact that, for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one holding the cards. The room felt thick, suffocating with tension, the weight of betrayal pressing down on all of us like a storm about to break. She turned toward me, her lips trembling, but I could already predict what was coming. The excuses. The lies. The half-baked justifications. I had seen it before, played out in countless ways by people who thought they were smarter than the consequences of their actions. Listen, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I cut her off before she could even begin spinning her tale. Don't. Just don't. She flinched as if I had struck her. Her lover's husband, Mark, was still standing near the doorway, his expression unreadable but his jaw clenched tight. He hadn't taken his eyes off her. There was something unsettling in the way he watched her, like he was seeing her for what she truly was for the first time. Sheila, he said after a long pause, his voice cold, precise, I need to ask you something. And I want the truth. She swallowed, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. Did you ever think about the damage? Mark asked. His voice wasn't raised, but there was an edge to it, something sharp enough to cut through bone. Did you ever, for even 1 second, consider what this would do to the people around you? Sheila didn't respond right away. Her mouth opened and closed, but the words wouldn't come out. Because I'll tell you what I thought, he continued, stepping closer. I thought I had a wife who loved me. I thought I was starting a family with someone who actually gave a damn. And while I was working overtime, saving money, preparing for a future that I thought we both wanted, you were sneaking around, tearing it apart behind my back. Sheila looked like she wanted to vanish. She started again. You what? Mark interrupted. You were going to tell me it just happened? That you didn't mean to hurt anyone? That it was a mistake? He let out a bitter laugh. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is buying the wrong brand of coffee. What you did was a choice. Every single time you lied, every single time you snuck around, every single time you came home to me after being with him, it was a choice. I exhaled slowly, watching Sheila as she trembled under his words. I had no sympathy for her. Not anymore. Maybe once, a long time ago, when I was still naive enough to believe in us, to believe that love could excuse everything. But not anymore. Then, something in her expression shifted. Panic gave way to something uglier, defensiveness. Her back straightened slightly, and her lips curled into a scowl. Oh, so now I'm just the villain, huh? She snapped, her voice sharp. Like I'm the only one who's ever done something wrong? Like you two are just perfect little angels. I could have laughed at how quickly she flipped the narrative. It was a classic move cornered with the truth, and instead of owning up to it, she lashed out, trying to spread the blame around. Mark scoffed. You think this is about us? You think you get to be the victim now? She crossed her arms. Maybe if you had actually paid attention to me, Mark. Maybe if you weren't always so busy working. His eyes flashed with something dangerous. You mean the work that was putting a roof over your head? The work that was paying for your prenatal vitamins? Sheila paled instantly. Mark shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. I leaned back, watching the scene unfold like a spectator at a play. This was better than anything I could have planned. Sheila wasn't just unraveling, she was imploding. And then she made the mistake of turning toward me. And you, she spat, her voice trembling. You set this up, didn't you? You wanted this to happen. You just love seeing me suffer. I held her gaze, my expression unreadable. You know what's funny, Sheila? I said calmly. For weeks, I knew. I knew about him, about all the little rendezvous, about the pathetic excuses you made. And you know what I did? She didn't answer. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Nothing. I didn't rage. I didn't confront you. I didn't throw your things out onto the front lawn. I just waited. Her breath hitched. I waited, I continued, for you to make the first move, for you to be the one to say the words. And here we are. Sheila's hands balled into fists. You're sick. I chuckled. No, Sheila. I'm just patient. Silence filled the room again. The weight of everything hung over us like a storm cloud ready to burst. And then Mark did something none of us expected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and pressed play. The audio that filled the room made Sheila's face completely drain of color. It was her. Her voice, clear as day, whispering to his wife, laughing, bragging, mocking me, mocking him. She had no idea the entire time. She was being recorded. I leaned back, watching the horror spread across her face. Now it was time for her to listen. The moment the recording started playing, Sheila's face contorted into something I'd never seen before. Pure, unfiltered terror. It was the kind of fear that couldn't be faked, the realization that every lie, every betrayal, every whispered secret she thought was buried deep had just been resurrected in the worst way possible. Mark's phone sat on the table, speaker volume turned up to the maximum, and the room filled with the unmistakable sound of her own voice. He has no clue. Absolutely none. He's so clueless, it's almost pathetic. The laughter that followed sent a chill down my spine. It was her. I recognized that laugh. I had heard it 1,000 times before in different contexts. Soft, flirty, teasing. But this time, it was dripping with contempt. I mean, I get home, and he actually kisses me like he's happy to see me. Ugh, I have to stop myself from cringing. I just tell him I'm tired, and he believes it. Every single time. I felt my stomach twist as I listened. No matter how much I had prepared for this moment, hearing it was something else entirely. Sheila lurched forward and grabbed for the phone, but Mark was faster. He yanked it away before she could reach it. "Oh no," he said darkly, stepping back. "You're going to listen to this, Sheila. You owe us that much." Her head snapped toward me, desperate now. "You're just going to let him do this?" she pleaded. "This is private. You don't get to do this." I tilted my head, studying her. "Private?" I echoed. "You mean like our marriage? Like your affair? Like all the times you sat across from me, lying to my face?" Her lip trembled. She had no defense. And the best part, her voice crackled through the speaker again. "If he ever finds out, if he ever grows a spine and actually asks me, I'll just gaslight him. That's what works best on guys like him. Make him think he's crazy. Flip the whole thing around on him, and he'll start apologizing to me. It's so easy." My hands clenched into fists beneath the table. So that was it. That was how she saw me. Not as her husband. Not as the man who had stood by her, trusted her, loved her. But as a joke. Mark scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Wow," he muttered. "Even for a cheater, you're a different breed, Sheila." Her chest was rising and falling rapidly now, panic setting in fully. "That's not fair," she hissed, her voice shaking. "You don't understand the full context. You're just playing parts of it." Mark's mouth twitched into something that almost resembled a smirk. "You want full context?" he asked. "Fine." He scrolled through his phone, tapped something, and suddenly, a new recording started playing. This time, it wasn't just Sheila's voice. There was another one. A man's voice. "You sure he won't find out? You're playing a dangerous game, babe." "Oh, please. My husband? He wouldn't find a clue if I stapled it to his forehead." I felt my nails dig into my palms. And then came the final blow. "Besides," Sheila's voice purred, "if he does find out, I'll just leave. No big deal. I already have an exit plan." She had planned this. All of it. Every single moment. The dinner. The speech. Her leaving. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was calculated. She had been planning to walk away from me long before I ever knew anything was wrong. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, to suppress the storm brewing inside me. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But Sheila? She was falling apart. Her hands were shaking as she looked between us, her pupils blown wide, sweat forming at her temples. This isn't what you think," she babbled, her voice erratic now. "I was just venting. People say things they don't mean sometimes. You can't take everything at face value." Mark stared at her, expression blank. "Were you venting?" he asked coldly. "Or were you lying to my face every single day for the past 6 months?" Sheila couldn't answer, because she knew the truth. And now, so did we. I let the silence hang between us, stretching the tension so tight it could snap. Then, finally, I spoke. "You know what, Sheila?" My voice was eerily calm. "You were right about one thing." She looked up at me, face pale, eyes hollow. "I never saw it," I admitted. "I never saw you. The real you. I never realized I was married to someone who could look me in the eyes every day and think so little of me." She flinched, her breath hitching. "But you know what the best part of all this is?" I continued. "I'm not the one who's losing anything here. You are." She frowned slightly, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. What?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough to make her listen. "You think you're in control?" I said softly. "You think you're calling the shots here?" A small, humorless laugh escaped me. "Oh, Sheila," I murmured. "You have no idea what's coming next." And with that, I pulled out my own phone. Sheila's blood ran cold. Because if she thought this was bad, she had no idea what I had been preparing. The moment I pulled out my phone, Sheila's entire body went rigid. Her eyes widened, lips slightly parted as if she had just walked into a trap she never saw coming. And in a way, she had. For weeks, I had been waiting for this moment, this precise second where she would realize she wasn't in control. Her gaze flickered between me and the device in my hand, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I could see the gears in her head spinning at full speed, trying to calculate what I could possibly have on her. I tapped the screen lazily, unlocking it with my thumb. You know, Sheila, I mused, you always thought I was clueless. That I'd never suspect a thing. That I was just some pathetic, oblivious husband who would just sit there and take whatever scraps of attention you decided to throw my way. I looked up at her, locking eyes. But what if I told you? I knew everything long before you thought I did. Sheila's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. She didn't dare. I smirked. Oh, that got your attention, huh? I swiped through my files slowly, deliberately, savoring the tension. Tell me, Sheila, how long have you been seeing him? A year? 2. I pretended to think. Oh, wait. I already know. Sheila's shoulders tensed. Because I continued, have been recording you. Her face drained of all color. Mark let out a slow, humorless laugh from the side. Oh, this just keeps getting better. Sheila turned to me sharply, her voice cracking. That's insane. You wouldn't do that. I tilted my head. Wouldn't I? And then, I pressed play. The recording started simple, just static at first. Then came her voice. I don't even know why I'm still with him. He's just there. Like a piece of furniture. I don't even respect him anymore. The Sheila in the recording laughed. I mean, it's not like he'd ever leave. He's too much of a coward. A sharp intake of breath came from across the table. Mark's hands curled into fists. But my eyes never left her. Sheila's hands were shaking now. And the best part? The recorded version of her voice dripped with amusement. If he ever found out, it wouldn't even matter. He wouldn't do a thing. He'd just sit there like a pathetic little puppy and pretend it didn't happen. I let the silence stretch. Let her wallow in the weight of her own words. Then, I leaned in slightly, my voice low. You really thought I'd just sit there? I asked. Like a pathetic little puppy? Sheila's mouth opened, then closed again. There were no excuses left. Mark exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Wow, he muttered. Even I didn't think it was this bad. Sheila's face contorted. First with shame, then with anger. And I knew exactly what was about to happen. She would flip it. Try to turn it around. Play the victim. And sure enough. This is crazy, she suddenly snapped, shoving her chair back as she stood. You've been recording me? Spying on me? What kind of psycho does that? I chuckled darkly, shaking my head. See, this is why I recorded you. Because I knew this is exactly what you'd do. She was shaking now. But I wasn't finished. Oh, and before you try to play the whole, you violated my privacy card? I said, raising a brow. Let me remind you that you're the one who cheated. You're the one who made a fool out of me. So yeah, Sheila, I made sure to collect proof. Sheila's breathing was erratic. She turned to Mark in a panic, as if looking for anyone to take her side. But he just laughed. Oh no, he scoffed. You don't get to look at me for help. You did this to yourself. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. And then I dropped the real bombshell. I turned my phone toward her and tapped the screen one last time. The screen lit up, a video. And not just any video. A security cam recording. Of her. With him. Her affair partner. In our bedroom. Her breath caught in her throat. Her entire body locked up. I saw the exact second she realized this wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was checkmate. She stumbled backward, her legs nearly giving out. You. Her voice cracked. You had cameras? I gave her a slow, satisfied nod. Yep. Silence. Pure, suffocating silence. And then, in the quiet, I added the final words she never thought she'd hear. You said you were leaving me, Sheila? I smiled, tilting my head. Well, you don't have to. Because I'm kicking you out first. And this? This was just the beginning. For the first time since this nightmare started, Sheila was speechless. Completely, utterly frozen. Her entire world had just collapsed in on itself, and she knew it. The smug confidence she had at the beginning of the night was gone, shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. She had walked in here thinking she had the upper hand, thinking she was in control of the situation, that she would sit me down like some pathetic fool, deliver her grand announcement, and then leave without consequences. But now, she was the one backed into a corner. I watched her with calculated patience, allowing the full weight of her reality to settle on her shoulders. She was processing, trying to figure out her next move, but there wasn't one. Not anymore. And then, it happened. The mask slipped. Her breathing grew heavier, more erratic. Her hands balled into trembling fists. And that's when I saw it, that flicker of something darker behind her eyes. Anger. You set me up, she finally breathed, voice quivering. You planned this. I shrugged, keeping my expression unreadable. You planned to cheat, I said simply. I just made sure you got caught. Her nostrils flared. You're sick, she spat. Recording me? Setting up cameras? Do you know how insane that is? I chuckled. Oh, now you want to talk about boundaries? I leaned back in my chair, tapping my fingers against the table. You had no problem sneaking around, lying to my face, and making me look like a fool. But the moment you get caught, suddenly, I'm the bad guy. Sheila's lips pressed into a thin line, but she wasn't done. This is illegal, she snapped. I can sue you for this. Mark let out a bark of laughter. Sheila, please. He scoffed. You want to play the legal card? You do realize you're the one on camera committing adultery, right? He shook his head, chuckling bitterly. God, I can't believe I ever respected you. That hit her. I could see it in the way she flinched, her confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. But Sheila was too stubborn to back down. You don't understand, she hissed, turning back to me. I never wanted to hurt you. I just... Stop. I cut her off before she could even try. I had heard enough. Sheila blinked. Stop, Sheila. My voice was sharp, final. I don't want your excuses. I don't want your fake apologies. I don't even care about the why anymore. I just want you gone. She inhaled sharply, shaking her head as if trying to cling to the situation. You don't get to just kick me out, she snapped. This is my home, too. I smirked. Not anymore. Her brows furrowed. What? And that's when I dropped the bombshell. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folder. A thick, legally bound folder with her name on it. Sheila's eyes flickered to the papers inside. Her divorce papers. Already signed. Already filed. Already done. Her jaw dropped. She looked genuinely stunned for the first time. You already filed? I nodded, slowly flipping through the pages. Oh yeah. Weeks ago, actually. I tilted my head. Funny thing, Sheila, while you were sneaking around, assuming I was blind, I was making sure you walked into the biggest mistake of your life. She swallowed. You. And guess what else? I continued. You remember our prenup? That's when the real panic set in. Because yes, Sheila and I had signed a prenup when we got married. At the time, she thought nothing of it. We were young, in love, and she never imagined she'd be on the losing end of it. But now, that prenup was about to wreck her entire life. Her hand shook as she snatched the folder from my hands, scanning the document like she could somehow change what was already written. I watched her pupils dilate as she reached the worst part. I leaned in, voice low and almost mocking. You get nothing. Her breath hitched. Wait. You heard me. I gestured toward the papers. That prenup you signed? It explicitly states that in the case of infidelity, you get zero financial compensation. No house. No cars. Not a single cent. Her entire body went stiff. No, she whispered, shaking her head violently. No. This isn't fair. You can't just leave me with nothing. Mark laughed again, but there was no humor in it. Oh, but he can. And he did. Sheila's head snapped toward me. Her face was twisted in rage, in desperation, in sheer disbelief that she was actually losing. You set me up, she accused again, but her voice cracked this time. I shrugged. Maybe, I admitted. Or maybe I just made sure karma hit you at full force. A thick silence filled the room, suffocating. Sheila's lips parted, then closed again. She looked like she wanted to scream, to cry, to run. But there was nowhere left to go. And then? She did the only thing she could. She lunged for my phone. But I was faster. I snatched it off the table before she could even come close, my grip tightening around it. Oh, Sheila, I'd scared, shaking my head. You really think destroying my phone is going to save you? She froze. Because she knew. She knew there were copies. She knew the evidence was already sent to the right people. And that's when she lost it. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Her breathing was ragged, her whole body trembling. Please, she whispered. Please, don't do this to me. I leaned forward. You did this to yourself. And then, I pointed toward the door. Now get out. For the first time in her miserable, selfish life, Sheila had no choice but to listen. She was defeated. Checkmate. And as she finally grabbed her purse, her hand shaking, and walked toward the door, I did something I never thought I'd do. I smiled. Because I was finally free. The door clicked shut behind her, but I didn't move. Not immediately. Instead, I just sat there, letting the weight of the moment settle into my bones. Sheila was gone. For good. The storm that had been brewing for weeks, months, years, had finally broken, and all that remained now was the silence. Mark let out a low whistle, leaning against the table with a look of utter disbelief. "Man," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "I gotta say, I didn't think you had it in you." I let out a slow breath, leaning back in my chair. "Yeah, well," I said, "neither did she. That was the thing, wasn't it? She never thought I'd do anything. Never thought I'd fight back. Never thought I'd be capable of anything other than sitting quietly while she tore my life apart piece by piece. She had underestimated me. And now? She had nothing." Mark exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I should be heading out," he said. "I've got my own mess to deal with." I nodded, standing up and reaching for the bottle of whiskey I had left on the counter. "You need a drink before you go?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Nah, man. I need about 20, but I'll save it for later." He hesitated, then met my gaze. "Listen, if you ever need anything, you let me know. I mean it." I offered him a small nod. "Same goes for you." With that, he gave me one last look before heading toward the door, leaving me alone in what now felt like a completely different house. I stood there for a moment, staring at the space Sheila used to occupy. The chair she had been sitting in, still slightly pulled out. The wine glass she barely touched. The air still held the last remnants of her perfume, but it was already fading. I took a slow sip of my drink, the burn grounding me in reality. And then, without thinking, I laughed. Not out of joy, not even out of relief, but out of sheer, absolute disbelief at how much of a fool I had been. How many times had I ignored the warning signs? How many times had I convinced myself that things would get better? That maybe I was just imagining things? That maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as heartless as my gut kept telling me she was? I had wasted years on a woman who never saw me as anything more than an inconvenience. But not anymore. That's when I heard it. A knock. Slow. Deliberate. I frowned, setting my glass down. For a brief, horrifying second, I thought it was Sheila again. Maybe she had come back, thinking she could manipulate her way out of this. But as I approached the door, something told me this wasn't her. I swung it open and froze. Standing there, on my porch, was a woman I hadn't seen in years. And she was smiling. For a moment, I just stood there, staring. The past few hours had drained me, leaving me feeling like an empty shell. But now, standing at my door, was someone I never expected to see again. "Hey," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Jessica." I finally managed to say, my brain catching up with the moment. Jessica and I had history. A good history, before Sheila ever came into the picture. We had been close once, maybe even more than that. But life had taken us in different directions, and when I met Sheila, I had convinced myself that I had found the one. I had been wrong. Jessica offered a small smile, tilting her head slightly. "I heard what happened," she said, her eyes scanning my face. "Are you okay?" It was such a simple question, and yet, for the first time in years, someone was actually asking it, not because they wanted something, not because they needed reassurance, but because they genuinely cared. I let out a small chuckle, shaking my head. "Honestly, I don't know." She nodded, as if she understood exactly what I meant. "That's fair." Then, after a brief pause, she added, "But I do know one thing, you're finally free." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Free. For so long, I had been trapped in a marriage that was built on lies. A relationship where I had to constantly prove my worth to someone who never saw my value. And now, standing here, in this moment, I realized she was right. I was free. A slow, genuine smile formed on my lips. "Yeah," I said, exhaling deeply. "I guess I am." Jessica's eyes softened. "Come on," she said, jerking her head toward her car. "Let's get out of here. Clear your head for a bit." For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of hesitation holding me back. I didn't feel trapped, or uncertain, or like I was making some kind of mistake. I nodded, because for the first time in years, I was choosing myself. As I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. and I was finally ready to start living it.